She was an engineer, proud and confident, certain that no one beneath her could ever match her skill. When she saw the black mechanic step forward, she didn't see talent, she saw someone to laugh at. With a smirk, she threw down a challenge meant to humiliate him. "Fix this engine, and I'll marry you." To her, it was a joke. To him, it was an insult wrapped in arrogance. But what happened next would shatter every expectation. Because in a world that often tries to belittle, sometimes the very person mocked the most carries the power to redefine everything. The moment his hands touched that engine, the story changed. And when it ended, the question wasn't whether he could fix it, but whether she'd ever laugh again. For most people, he was invisible. Just another mechanic, grease-stained hands working late nights in a small garage on the edge of town. His name was David, and fixing engines wasn't just his job, it was his lifeline. Each bolt, each spark, each hum of machinery carried him closer to the dreams he refused to let go of. He didn't have wealth or status, but he had something far more powerful: skill, patience, and a determination born from years of being told he wasn't enough. The workshop was his safe place, where the world's prejudice couldn't drown out the steady rhythm of tools hitting steel. Yet, even within that space, whispers followed him. People doubted, mocked, dismissed him, not because of what he could or couldn't do, but because of the color of his skin. And then there was her. Clara, the engineer. She walked into the garage that afternoon with confidence that demanded attention. Highly educated, sharp-minded, she carried herself as though no one could challenge her authority. When her gaze landed on David, it wasn't with respect, it was with amusement. To her, he wasn't a mechanic, he was a joke waiting to be exposed. Neither of them knew it yet, but that meeting was the spark. What began as arrogance and insult was about to ignite a test of pride, skill, and dignity that would silence the laughter forever. David wiped his hands on an old rag, unaware that the next few minutes would etch themselves into his memory forever. Clara stood at the edge of the workshop, arms folded, a faint smirk tugging at her lips. Her colleagues, young engineers in polished shirts, hovered behind her, whispering and laughing under their breath. "This," she said, pointing to the massive diesel engine on the floor, "isn't just any repair. It's an impossible one. Even trained specialists fail at this. But since you claim to be so talented, let's see what you can do." Her words dripped with condescension, each syllable designed to sting. David looked at the engine. Rusted bolts, leaking pipes, a fractured timing system. It was a mess, yes, but not beyond saving. He had seen worse. But this wasn't about machinery anymore. This was about dignity. About being mocked not because of his skills, but because of who he was. The engineers laughed as Clara delivered her final blow. "Fix this engine, and I'll marry you." Laughter exploded around the room. To them, it was a cruel joke, a spectacle at his expense. To David, it was humiliation masked as entertainment. For a moment, he stood frozen. Every eye was on him, waiting for him to crumble, to back away, to accept the role they had written for him, the man who wasn't good enough. His stomach tightened, but his eyes didn't drop. Instead, he walked slowly toward the engine. "Fine," he said quietly, his voice steady. "I'll fix it." The room fell silent for a heartbeat, then erupted in fresh laughter. They didn't believe him. They couldn't. A black mechanic with grease-stained clothes, daring to prove himself in front of educated engineers? To them, the very idea was laughable. But David wasn't listening anymore. He was already kneeling beside the engine, his hands moving with precision. The clang of his wrench echoed louder than their mockery. Each twist of metal was a declaration: "I am more than what you think of me." Hours blurred. Sweat dripped down his face, mixing with the oil on his skin. Clara circled the room, tossing sharp remarks to keep the humiliation alive. "Careful there, you'll only make it worse." Her voice rang out, sharp and dismissive. "Don't hurt yourself." Still, David pressed on. Piece by piece, the engine began to shift from ruin to resurrection. The bolts tightened. The leak sealed. The fractured system found rhythm again. And slowly, unease began to creep into the laughter. One by one, the smiles faded. They leaned closer, realizing that what they thought was impossible was actually taking shape before their eyes. Clara's smirk wavered, though she tried to mask it with a roll of her eyes. David felt their stares, but he kept his focus. This wasn't about them. It wasn't even about her. It was about every time he had been told, "You can't." Every door slammed in his face. Every insult, every smirk, every whispered doubt. With every tightened bolt, he was silencing those voices. Finally, he pulled the starter. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. His heart pounded. Then, the engine roared to life, smooth and steady, as if it had never been broken at all. The room froze. The laughter died. Shock washed across their faces, erasing every trace of mockery. Clara's eyes widened, her confidence cracking as the truth roared louder than the machine itself. But before David could even take a breath of victory, Clara's voice cut in, sharper than ever. "So what? One lucky fix doesn't prove anything." She tried to dismiss it, but her voice carried a tremor that betrayed her disbelief. The other engineers exchanged glances. Some shifted uncomfortably, others stared at David with a new, begrudging respect. The humiliation they had expected had turned back on them. David didn't respond. He didn't need to. The engine spoke louder than words ever could. Yet deep inside, he knew this wasn't the end. For people like Clara, a single triumph wasn't enough to erase prejudice. She wouldn't let it go so easily. And he wasn't done proving himself, not yet. The real test had only just begun. The engine's steady roar filled the garage, drowning out the silence that had fallen like a heavy curtain. For a moment David simply stood there, chest rising and falling, his hands trembling from exhaustion. He had done it. The impossible. The very thing they said couldn't be done. But before the weight of triumph could sink in, Clara's voice cut through the air like a blade. "Don't be fooled," she said sharply, addressing the room as much as David. "He didn't fix it, he patched it. Temporary. Anyone can tinker until it sputters back to life. It won't last. It never does." Her words carried venom, her pride clawing for survival. The engineers behind her shifted uneasily, glancing between her and the running engine. They knew what they were seeing. They knew it wasn't luck. But none dared challenge her authority. David's jaw tightened. He wanted to believe the work spoke for itself. That results would silence doubt. But Clara wasn't finished. She stepped closer, her voice dripping with scorn. "Do you really think this proves anything? A mechanic in overalls, pretending to stand where real engineers belong? Skill isn't enough. You'll never belong in this world, not with us. Not with me." The words stung, sharper than any tool he'd ever held. He had heard insults before, but this was different. This wasn't just a dismissal of his work, it was a denial of his very place in the world. The other engineers laughed nervously, unsure whether to join her mockery or remain silent. David felt their eyes piercing him, weighing him down, daring him to crack under the pressure. His chest burned with anger, but beneath it was something heavier, the familiar ache of injustice. He could fix engines, but he couldn't fix the hatred etched into their stares. Clara smirked, tilting her head. "Go on then. Celebrate. But remember, one miracle doesn't erase who you are." David swallowed hard. His hands clenched into fists, black with grease. Every instinct told him to walk away, to let the engine speak for him. But another voice whispered inside, "If you stay silent now, they'll never stop. This moment will define you." So he spoke, his voice low but steady. "You set the terms, Clara. You said if I fixed it, you'd marry me. And I fixed it." The room went still. The words hung heavy, daring her to answer. For the first time, Clara faltered. A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. Then, almost instantly, it hardened into rage. "Marry you?" she spat. "Do you think I'd ever lower myself like that? This was a joke, and you were too stupid to see it. People like you should know their place." Gasps rippled through the room. Even her colleagues weren't prepared for the naked cruelty of her words. Some shifted back, their laughter dying in their throats. David's heart pounded, but he stood his ground. Her words were meant to crush him, to turn victory into humiliation. But instead, they ignited something deeper, a fire he had carried all his life. He stepped forward, closing the space between them. Not in anger, not in threat, but with a calm strength that forced her to meet his eyes. You can laugh. You can mock. But the truth is standing right here, running louder than your words. That engine works. And no matter what you say, you'll never erase what I've done. Clara's face flushed, her composure cracking as murmurs filled the room. The other engineers were no longer laughing. Some looked at David with quiet respect, others with shame for having joined the mockery. Clara, for the first time, seemed small in her defiance. But even in that moment, she couldn't let go. She turned on her heel, muttering bitterly, "This proves nothing. Nothing at all." And with that, she stormed out, her pride in tatters. The garage was silent except for the steady hum of the engine, a sound that now felt like a heartbeat, a declaration of victory. David stood there, breathing hard, his chest heavy with both triumph and hurt. He had faced the worst of their ridicule, stripped bare by their prejudice. And yet, against every attempt to break him, he had won. Still, he knew this wasn't the end. Because victories like these, for men like him, were never final. The question wasn't whether he had proven himself, it was whether the world would ever allow him to be seen for who he truly was. The engine continued to hum, steady and unshakable, even after Clara's footsteps faded from the garage. That sound, low, rhythmic, alive, was more than just proof of David's skill. It was a symbol. For him, it was vindication, the undeniable truth that he was capable, talented, and worthy. For everyone else watching, it was a reminder that arrogance and prejudice could not silence ability. Yet even in his moment of victory, David knew the battle was far from over. One engine wouldn't erase years of bias. One triumph wouldn't dismantle a world built on unequal foundations. The laughter might have stopped that day, but the looks, the whispers, the quiet doors that slammed shut, those would remain. Still, something had shifted. For the first time, some of those engineers saw him differently. Not as a joke. Not as less than. But as a man whose work demanded respect. David walked away from that garage changed. Not because Clara had mocked him, he had endured worse before. Not even because he had proven her wrong. What truly changed him was the realization that his fight wasn't just personal. Every insult he absorbed, every challenge thrown to break him, every laugh that tried to reduce him to nothing, those weren't just about him. They were about every black man or woman who had ever been underestimated, dismissed, or denied a chance simply because of the color of their skin. In that sense, his victory was larger than a fixed engine. It was a stand, a quiet defiance against a system that had long thrived on silence. And yet, the story doesn't end with one man proving himself. Because for every David who silences the room with undeniable skill, there are countless others whose talents are buried under the weight of prejudice. For every engine that roars back to life, there are doors still closed to those who should have been let in long ago. That's the reality of racism. It doesn't always come in the form of violence or open hatred. Sometimes it hides behind laughter, behind jokes, behind lowered expectations and whispered doubts. And those wounds, invisible to the world, can cut the deepest. David never saw Clara again. But the challenge she set that day, the arrogance in her tone, the cruelty of her words, remained etched in his memory. Not as pain, but as fuel. Every time he faced another doubter, another smirk, another dismissal, he remembered that moment and the roar of the engine that proved them all wrong. The impact was clear. Prejudice tried to break him, but instead, it sharpened him. Racism tried to humiliate him, but instead, it revealed his strength. And in his strength, others found hope. Because stories like David's aren't just about one man. They are mirrors, reflecting truths too many would rather look away from. They force us to ask, How many more times will talent be mocked before it's recognized? How many more Davids must fight twice as hard just to be seen as equal? And perhaps the most important question of all, when will laughter stop being a weapon? As the engine's hum finally quieted, David carried that sound with him, not just as proof of what he could do, but as a reminder of what still needed to change. His story is one of countless others. A reminder that dignity should never be something a person has to earn, and respect should never depend on proving worth to those who refuse to see it. So, the next time you hear someone dismissed, laughed at, or underestimated because of who they are, ask yourself, will you stand with the laughter or with the truth?